All right. Good night, everyone. Thanks, everyone, for attending. My name is Carlos Kaigi at Twitter and all the other social networks. So today I'm going to talk about how Rails loves the front end. Who here is familiar with Rails? Cool. Good show of hands. So if you all know, Rails is known as a full-stack web development framework, which does a pretty good job at backend, but also a really good job with the front end. So this is the basic structure of what Rails has been doing for over 10 years, right? So server-side rendering. And how that works, we have a browser, which is nothing more than just a frame. So let's suppose it's just a frame. So the browser makes a GET request or a web request to Rails. And what Rails does, Rails is going to process that request, access the database, run authentication, authorization. It's going to do what it's got to do, and then it's going to generate an HTML, which is going to send back to the client. Once that HTML reaches the client, the browser renders that, paints, does all its job, right? So it's basically displaying the HTML to the client. Then the client might choose to click on a link. When a client does that, then another request is issued to Rails, to the back end, and then Rails does the same thing. It accesses the database, does all the stuff that it has to do, authentication, maybe it reads the fragment from caching, any of that stuff, and then it generates another HTML that it sends back to the client. Again, once that HTML reaches the client, we see a full page reload, right? So we see the page blinking for a little bit. If we had our mouse focused on a specific input text and we lost the focus, we lost everything, that's a full page reload. And that's what Rails got really good at for the last 10 or so years. And then Rails 4 comes around, and then they introduce something called Turbolinks. What Turbolinks does, it leverages the modern technologies of the browser. So browsers have gotten really smart over the years, really performant, really good at executing JavaScript. So now with Turbolinks, what happens, you make the first request to Rails, Rails still processes the server side, generates the HTML, sends the HTML over the wire to the client. The client reads that HTML, paints it to the user the same way that it did before. Now, when you click on a link, what Rails does with Turbolinks, Rails hijacks that click, and instead of a regular GET request, it generates an AJAX request, an XML HTTP request. So that reaches the client. Rails still produces the same HTML, sends the same HTML over the wire. However, once it reaches the client, there's a JavaScript that runs that compares the HTML that was sent from Rails on the new request with the existing HTML. And what it does is it replaces the title tag and the body tag using JavaScript. So instead of seeing that full page reload, you don't see anything, right? You just see the page magically almost updating. So you have sort of that perceived performance. So that's Turbolinks. That's the first version of Turbolinks that was released with Rails 4. And upcoming is Rails 5. And Rails 5 brings a new version of Turbolinks, Turbolinks 3. And one of the coolest features of Turbolinks 3 is called partial replacement. So to better illustrate partial replacement, I'm going to show a quick demo. So I have that running. Okay, cool. Everybody see that? So what I have here is actually the timestamp that this particular div was generated. So you can see the timestamp at the top and each timestamp for each individual div here at the bottom. So what's going to happen is I'm going to click on more info. And as you can see, the timestamp here at the bottom was refreshed because it generated a new div. But the one at the top was not refreshed because it's still the same element. So if you imagine you have things like the header on websites, like the shopping cart, like your menu, the menu div with the sign-in settings and all that stuff. Now Rails is smart enough to compare the two HTML versions, the new one that was requested from that was sent by the server with the one that existed on the client, and it only changes the part of the body that actually changed from one request to the other. Some of you might think this is familiar to what React does, which in fact it is. It's sort of a diffing. However, React is a little bit more granular, more specific, and Rails is more of a generic. But this comes out of the box in Rails 5. So Rails still loves the front end. Questions? What's up?
So, how does it handle scripts that like for a while or something? I know the browser only says stop that script because it doesn't refresh the page.
So how does he handle scripts that are running for a while? So if the script is running on a div that was not refreshed, on a part of the page that wasn't touched, that script will still keep on running.
So it does. So if it is part of that script is part of. Right. So I think because I've tried to do something similar to that, just about. I've run into issues with like scripts continue running, that just because the page wasn't refreshed.
Okay, that's a good point. So Turbolinks changes, of course, the way that events are triggered on your page, and it offers you a bunch of additional events that you can listen to if you need to do stuff like that. If you need a more granular control
What I'm
over.
saying is integration with other scripts that
Right.
aren't necessarily
Yep.
expecting the page to change.
Yep, exactly. So there are custom events that you will have to listen to bind to if you have specific scripts that are running.
Okay.
Yep. Cool. Any other question? What's up?
Is there any special markup you have to do to make that all work?
Is there any specific markup that you have to do? And the answer is yes. There is one attribute that you have to add to your div. It's called data-turbolinks-permanent. So whatever element has that attribute, it will stick to the page between navigations, which is what happened to that big input text at the top.
So you're more telling it what to keep instead of what to swap.
Exactly.
Is this optional in Rails 5 or is it required?
This is optional. So if you want to opt in, you add this attribute that I just told Marcella, the Turbolinks data permanent, and that thing will just magically work.
How big is the package that handles all of the...
How big is the package? I'm not sure, because again, this is out of the box. This is Rails out of the box. It's part of Rails. You don't have to install anything. You don't have to, you just start a Rails application just like you have for the past 10 years. So this is something that will just work. Right. No fatigue.
What's happened when a user clicks on a broken link? How does Rails deals with a broken backslash?
Okay, so what happens when a user clicks on a broken link?
With the DOM. What's happened to the DOM?
What happens to the DOM? I believe that Rails generates the 500 page, and it just sends that page back to the client, and it just renders the 500 just as it would before.
But something happens in the client side?
The client will just render the HTML for the 500, whichever it is. So, cool, awesome, thanks.